The Mind's Eye podcast with DJ Turnoff is available on iTunes, Pandora, Amazon, and all major platforms. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you subscribing. Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. You're now standing at the intersection between history and mystery, the center of science and the strange, and your source for the subliminal to the criminal. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff, host of this auditorium of audacity. We're going to serve you up some existential dread tonight. No, I'm just kidding. A little existential hope, I guess. And to poorly sum up Plato and the theme of tonight's show, either death is a state of nothingness or there's a migration of the soul into another world. Let's do a little experiment with the listeners here. Raise your hand right now for those who are afraid of dying. Well, then you're like me, for sure. Keep your hands raised if you're also like me, and that the reason for that is because you don't know if consciousness exists after we die. I mean, is that it? If you're on the other side of that part, then God bless you, because, I guess I'll give you the opportunity. Raise your hand if you're one of those people who isn't afraid of death. And keep them raised if the reason for that is because you think that God exists, and there definitely is an afterlife. You probably see God in everything that you do, in nature, space, people. So, I wish I was fully convinced and like on you, but either way, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, this show's for you. And really, this is part one of a two-parter. It's a little series we're doing here. We're starting with the afterlife. Then next week, we're going to go take a look at whether God exists based on 3 recent scientific discoveries. For this one, part one, we got Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts. If that name sounds familiar, then you probably listened to the last episode. I think this is probably the quickest turnaround with a guest ever. We've had, we've had them twice in the same calendar year, but literally never back to back. But he is a Renaissance man, and he can speak to a lot of different topics. He's going to tell us about his personal search for heaven. A historian investigates the case for the afterlife, book of the same name. Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts, he believes that near-death experiences probably present the most dramatic evidence for an afterlife, and subsequently that consciousness can exist outside of the body. The good doctor has collected information from a variety of near-death experience studies, so he's going to, based on what he's collected there, he's going to tell us about what happens after we die. Is death the end, or is it a beginning? If it is just the beginning, what does it look like when we die? I mean, does a spiritual world exist? Find out in a mind's eye moment. If you haven't been following us on social media, you really should, because I started something new recently, a couple episodes ago. So, I always do a lot of preparation for the show, so I figured I might as well take you on that journey and just start tweeting and posting on Facebook quotes and excerpts from the book that the episode's going to be based on. You should definitely check it out. The links to the social media on our website, themindseyemedia.com. Make sure you put the word "the" there first. You'll also find hand-selected news articles. I read every single one that I post. Some also blog articles that I've written. And for me, at least, most importantly, is the opportunity for you to show a little support to the show, while also adding to the Mind's Eye library. If you're at the top of the website, hit the donate button. It helps to cover the production cost, and also all the time and energy that it takes to go into every single show. And not to mention the 120 plus free episodes that you can listen to at any time. Made it real easy for you. Again, press the donate button at the top of the website, themindseyemedia.com. You scratch my back, I'm definitely going to scratch yours. Everyone who donates gets a never heard before unaired episode of The Mind's Eye. And the more you donate, the more you're going to get. Enough of that. Let's welcome back Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts with a record time of our quickest turnaround here on The Mind's Eye. Appreciate your time again, especially on such back-to-back times.
Brian, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And tonight we're going to talk a very different topic than the last time. We're going to go from Dali to death with the doctor here. We're going to talk about his book, came out a couple years ago, The Search for Heaven, a historian investigates the case for the afterlife. I mean, what do you tell somebody like me who, well, you started off the book by saying that, most people don't really think about death often, but I'm probably one of those people that is on the opposite end where, quite frankly, I think about death quite often in the afterlife, and I guess the possibilities that it terrifies me that there is kind of lack thereof, nothing afterwards after we die. I mean, what do you tell to somebody like me?
Well, that's a very good question, Brian. And I've been fascinated by the concept of an afterlife all my life. It came from my father. His mother, my grandmother, was spiritually gifted. She was a psychic, even though she would never admit it. But I remember her just, as a young child. But my father once told me a story that, and she was in church with her children one Sunday morning. Not all of the children were with her. The young ones were at home with a babysitter. She typically would attend 2 or 3 masses in a row. And in the middle of high mass, she got up and left the pew and walked out of the church, which was totally unprecedented for her. But the reason is she felt that something was very, very wrong. And true enough, when she came home, she found out that one of her younger ones had a terrible accident and had to be rushed to the hospital. There was nothing there to alert her to that. She simply sensed it. And that instant, she got up and walked away, which is, during the holiest moment of Mass. And there are several stories like it. My father was always intrigued by that. Unfortunately, he never had those same psychic sensitivities, to his great regret. He wished he had. Apparently, it jumps by generation. I have it a little bit. I sometimes I get up in the morning and there is a sense of unease. I don't know why. I just have a sense of unease, and sure enough, a few hours later, there will be an email with bad news. Like your book proposal has been declined, or there's a problem with this student, or whatever. It's very strange. And what really clinched it for me was, of course, the passing of my mother 4 years ago. My dad died 12, 13 years ago after a long illness, and it was a relief really for him and for us, because he suffered from cancer, and it was terrible to see him suffer so much. But my mom was in very good spirits, and when she died, just of old age, she was 93. I was very affected. I wasn't aware of it until we were all together in Holland at the funeral, and the service was over, and everything had gone very well. There were 100 people. She was a very, very well-known person, and she had tons of friends. And then when they came to take the coffin away to be cremated, and I was ready to get up and start worrying about, the coffee table that's part of the Dutch tradition there, I suddenly collapsed, and I lost all sense of time, and I started crying like a child, and I had no idea what's going on here. And that set me on a path to say, I want to figure out why it is that we are so afraid of death as people, as a race. Why are we so afraid of death? And of course, as a biblical historian, I know a lot about, maybe not enough, but I've studied ancient civilizations all my life and their beliefs in the afterlife. And they always had very, very strong belief in the afterlife. Whatever civilization you look at, whether it's Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism or Christianity, you will find or even the Greco-Roman tradition, you will find a very strong belief that there is an afterlife. And the reason why they believe that is, until the 19th century, before the Industrial Revolution, it was a given that we as human beings recognize that we are made up of 2 parts, a physical part and a spiritual part. And for many people, particularly in ancient times, that was a bonus. For many people, as I described in my books, life in ancient times was hard for most people. Daily life was hard. Physical life was hard. And for these people, the spiritual aspect of themselves was a refuge. They could lose themselves in their spiritual dimension and find peace that they could not find in their physical dimension. Now, fast forward to our life. And we are so coddled by the comforts of our first world existence that we don't longer have time for that. There was no need to worry about our spiritual dimension because all of the major challenges to human existence that really have vexed the human condition since the earliest of times have basically been resolved in our first world existence. Not for everyone, of course, but for most of us, we are so invested in the material comforts of our life, what to eat for breakfast, what movie to see at night, what do we have for dinner, that there's really no need for us to really think about the spiritual dimension of ourselves. And that's why we're so shocked and surprised when suddenly death enters into our lives, and particularly now. And that's what spurred me to write this book. Why is it that we are so afraid of death? And what can we do against it? What can help us to overcome that fear and sort of realign our thinking? That's basically the purpose of the book.
Most modern scientists' perspective today believe that consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, and essentially that dies with our body. And didn't you used to kind of hold that same sentiment as well?
As I write in the book, I agreed with most scholars and scientists that basically we are an accumulation of carbon, and carbon is destined to die. And with it, our sense of ourself, our consciousness, dies with it. And in preparation for this book, I subscribed to one of the journals of consciousness. For them, for the science, human consciousness is the equivalent of our brain. It is our brain. And so if you take the physical brain away, neurologists believe, then you also take away our consciousness. Now, the interesting thing that, of course, revolts against that is the whole situation of near-death experiences as well as regressive hypnotherapy. And these are two disciplines, one of the many disciplines I cover, because I don't only look at NDEs, there's been a lot of publications about that, of course, but I also look at quantum physics, I look at astrophysics, I look at the psychic experience. So what I'm trying to do is bring together many different disciplines to see if together they add up to evidence for the afterlife. And I think where we go off track is when we assume that our sense of identity of who we are, that sense of identity, is embedded in our biological self. If you look at NDE reports, and in my book, I survey a whole number of studies, almost 5,000 individual cases of near-death experiences, not just in the United States, not just in the Judeo-Christian culture, but also, for example, I cite studies among Muslim men and women in Iran, where multiple studies have taken place. And the experiences of these people in a very different culture, in a very different language, in a very different faith tradition, is virtually identical to the near-death experience of Jews and Christians and other people in the United States. Now, I've taught in psychology for a few years, and I can tell you, in every psychological study about anything that I've ever been involved with, these variables of different age, culture, gender, background, speech, language, are typically indicators of very different experiences. Why the near-death experience has virtually the same pattern, no matter where you look around the world in any culture, is one of the great mysteries of our time. And what I try to do on that basis is argue that the reason why there's a semblance is because they they tap into the same source. And that source is that if by any measure of our modern science, your body is dead. I mean, there are multiple case studies where the body was declared dead. This person is no longer alive. The brain is dead, the heart is dead, stop working. And then if after 10, 15, or even half an hour, that person is revived, they come back with the most amazing stories of their experiences. You know, I always like to cite the story of a woman who was blind from birth, meaning she never knew sight. She never had the ability of sight. And along the way, when she became an adult, she was married. She was an attractive woman, so she found a husband, and they lived happily ever after, even though she never saw him. She never knew what he looked like. And then she had an accident. She was in the hospital. She died. She had a near-death experience. And while she was dead, she for the first time saw her husband, saw him, not through her five senses of her physical presence, but through the sense of her spiritual presence. Now, when you see data like that, you kind of scratch your head and say, there is no way that conventional science can explain that. There is absolutely no way. And my conclusion is that what makes us conscious, what separates us from animals, what makes our conscious, our sense of identity, our sense of ourself, is part of that construct in ourself, which, you know, we might call our spiritual half. I'm a little concerned about using that word because many people associate it with religion. So many in the book, I refer to it as our energy self, a form of energy within ourselves that carries that kernel of identity, or what Plato called psyche, and that operates with our physical presence, but is in command of that physical presence. And when the mortal coil dies off, that particular energy continues on and goes back where it came from.
Of the near-death experiences, I mean, what were some of the biggest commonalities outside of, that they died, that they were clinically and scientifically dead, no brain or heart activity, but they came back to life and remembered it? I mean, what were the things that they remembered, and what were the biggest commonalities there?
That's a very good question. There were three. One is an overwhelming sense of peace. And mind you, these are people who just seconds before had been struggling with the most awful diseases, whether as a result of a car accident or cancer or anything like that. So these were people who were in intense pain or discomfort, and in that next moment felt no pain whatsoever. They felt a great sense of peace and well-being. The second thing they talk about, and this is virtually universal across all of these case studies, is a sense of light. Now, the role of that light tends to differ a little bit. Some people refer to it as a gate of light that they go through. Others feel it as a warmth that surrounds them, that comforts them. And that light guides them then to across sort of a threshold that then leads them into an incredible, a beautiful Shangri-La, as I describe it. I mean, the individual descriptions differ, but where most of them agree is that they step into a beautiful world of hills and palm trees and rivers. And, it's I suspect that these are visions that are sort of stimulated by the spiritual presence around them in order to comfort them, in order to help them through that transition. But nevertheless, it's a very, very common thing. And the third thing that they have in common is that there was a reluctance to go back to where they came from. They find themselves in such a beautiful, I don't want to call it place, because it's not really a place as such, as a location, but a beautiful setting, let's call it scène, mise en scène in French, that they don't want to go back. And in fact, many patients report that they were actually asked, they're trying to revive you, do you want to go back? And those who said yes, not because they wanted to, but because they felt an obligation towards the spouse or the children that were perhaps still very young, they said yes, of course. And the final thing to answer your question, and the most important thing that they found is that virtually all of these people had lost their fear of death, and that's the whole purpose of the book.
Yeah, I don't really want to have a near-death experience to lessen my fear of death here, but yeah, but we'll figure out some other ways here. Yeah, a fundamental aspect, or I guess core of a near-death experience is the out-of-body experience. And in the book, you mentioned actually having one. You mind just telling us a little bit about that story?
The out-of-body experience is not something that you need to be a psychic for. Or that only people with a near-death experience have. In fact, I'm not sure, but I think somewhere between 15 to 20% of your average person of the population can have such things. And it could be very quick, could be just a few seconds. In my case, it happened because I flew to France right after 9/11, and it was a very long flight. It was delayed because flight schedules were disrupted because of 9/11. By the time I got to my hotel, it was like 48 hours since I last slept, and I was wiped. And you know that feeling when you're so tired you cannot fall asleep. You know that sense. Well, that's what I had, and so all night long I was tossing and turning. I couldn't sleep, and this is cited as one of the conditions of an out-of-body experience. Is deep fatigue can get you there. And sure enough, I must have fallen asleep or lost consciousness somewhere around 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. The next thing I knew, there were two people in the room, and I can't really describe them. They were a presence. I knew they were there, and they lifted me up and they took me on the most incredible ride across the landscape of the Provence and the Alpilles mountain range. And one thing I remember was the sense of the wind ruffling through my hair. I still had hair back then, and this soaring over these incredible landscapes. And I looked at the guys next to me and they just smiled, And there was no communication, but there was a intense sense of feeling good. And it was an incredible experience. And before long, they brought me back. Next thing I know, I'm in my bed. And I'm sitting there with my mouth open. It was such an intense physical experience that I really felt I was out there, soaring over the mountains, over the ocean, the Mediterranean, the Côte d'Azur, and then I was back in bed. I was so affected that I had to call my wife, even though it was her time, like 3 o'clock in the morning, right? And I said, "You won't believe what happened. I had an out-of-body experience." And she says, "Yeah, okay, good."
I'm going back to bed.
Yeah, go back to bed. But here's the kicker. I must have been out, because I looked at the clock, for no more than 20, 30 minutes. And usually when I fly to Europe, I'm wiped, jet lag. 9 hours is pretty tough. I felt so refreshed. I never felt 1 minute of fatigue, not 1 minute of fatigue. I went out to dinner that night. I felt great. And I said to myself, how did that happen? There is not a normal explanation for that. So anyway, that was my OBE, my out-of-body experience.
Now, studies show that one that you mentioned, that the cause of death can actually have an influence on the type of near-death experience that you have.
That's right. Of course, this is my interpretation of these case studies. The more acute, the more abrupt the death, the different the near-death experience. For example, if you die near the end of your life, you've been chronically ill for quite some time, you and your family are prepared that the worst could happen, even though, of course, you hope it doesn't. The experience seems to be different. There is less of an attempt to negotiate the abrupt change to the spiritual universe, as I call it. Then if the experience is very abrupt, if you're riding your bike next thing you know, you're hit by a car, and an hour later you're in the emergency room, and they can't help you, and you die. Then for your identity, again, for your consciousness, it is a much more abrupt sensation than if you are at the end of a long illness. And it seems that at that moment, there are more characters involved, if you will. These people typically muster a greater reception committee, if I could call it that way. These people typically sense more of people who have gone before them, friends, relatives, who are there at the gate, at the threshold, as I call it, to help you negotiate that, because the experience is so much more shocking in that regard than if you're sort of slowly ebbing away from death, from life into the other world. The other thing that I want to mention before I forget is that I did work with a brilliant psychic, Susan Dunderdale Jones. She's very well known in Britain. It's one of the greatest blessings of my life is that I was introduced to her just before I started writing this book, and she's been a major collaborator in pulling this together. And the stories that she tells me, and they take up a chapter in the book, really will absolutely make you fall off your chair.
I thought it was an interesting choice to have that you pretty much, you put this chapter on psychic phenomenon and how that interplays with the afterlife, kind of just stuck in the middle of this book, and kind of in between, kind of sandwiched between some more, I guess, what other people would consider more serious inquiries into the afterlife, and someone like that biggest contributor who you're talking about is your psychic friend Sue Jones. What did Sue say to you to convince you of her psychic skills? And that way, I guess that kind of helps at least the listener be convinced of some of the things that she said.
That's a good question, Brian. Well, the first thing is just her presence. It was a difficult year that we went through, of course, the situation with my mother passing away. I was coping with that. There were also things going on at the university where I was teaching, where I really sharply disagreed with the certain decisions that were taking academically that affected our students. I was trying to struggle. I struggled with a book that I was working on. There were many reasons why it was a stressful time. The reason why we got together is because my wife, Kathy, was meeting with a good friend of ours, Anissa, and Susan was her guest. And of course, my wife, Kathy, had never met Susan ever, nor had Anissa told her about me specifically. But a half hour into the conversation at my friend's house, Susan suddenly turned to Kathy and says, you really have to talk to your husband. And she starts to elicit and describe all of the things I was struggling with at the time. The fact that I had trouble with insomnia, for example. He said, you really have to do some meditation, because I know he doesn't sleep very well. And my wife sat there open-mouthed, and she went on and on and on about these even the most detailed physical manifestations. And there is no way that she could have known that in any other form. She had never met me. She had never met my wife, Kathy. Anissa had never talked about me specifically, but she was very intrigued with me. And so she started to tell Kathy all of those things. And finally, Kathy said, well, you got to meet my husband. He's going to flip when he meets you. And she was right. So there is, I think, something that normal science cannot explain. This is sort of the stuff that I described in the book. And of course, I talk about lots of other things, lots of other evidence, quantum physics and astrophysics, and why the physical universe has so much in common with the spiritual universe, because they're all without a sense of time, without a sense of place, without a sense of death. You look at the universe, whenever a star implodes, 10 million other stars are born from its matter. And so that same cycle is happening in the spiritual universe. And anyway, she was a tremendous source and is a tremendous source of inspiration, and she has helped me to cultivate that. Of course, I'm not a psychic, and nor will I ever claim to be a psychic, but there are times when I get ready for bed at night that I feel her talking to me, not hear her. I feel her talking to me, and I will tell her, "Oh, thanks, Sue. That's great. That's nice to know," and she will know that I said that. I know that sounds weird, but I believe it's true.
Don't worry, you're on the right show for that. So you're all right. Yeah, you didn't really mention these personal psychic phenomena. You didn't mention your grandmother possibly having something. You didn't mention, that I guess how she sensed her husband's death, or now how you sense Sue. Why didn't you include that?
Well, that's a good question, Brian. I don't know why. I think it's because I didn't want this to be about me. I love Eben Alexander's book, Proof of
Neurologist.
Yeah. And many other people have written about their near-death experiences. Now, without disparaging any of that, and I really want to emphasize that, the problem with those books, or the issue with those books, is that they're clearly focused on the experience of that individual, of that person. And so it's difficult to extrapolate that individual experience, as wonderful as it may be, to the human population at large. And that's what I try to avoid. I try to not make this about me. I try to make it about the evidence that I found and what motivated me to do that in the story, pulling together all these different strands from all these different sciences. But
so pulling all of it together, the science, the religion, the history, it coalesced into one where you talked about and kind of showed us what the afterlife would look like.
That's a great question. A great moment also to sort of conclude the conversation. I tried to reconstruct it, and of course Sue was very, very much a key factor in that, because she's been there. I haven't. She sees those things. I don't. But she helped me do that, and we describe it as a sort of a time travel experience. Let's imagine that you leave Earth and you go to space. The reason why that analogy helps, because we are so invested in our five senses that it is very difficult for us to grapple with these amorphous concepts that we've been talking about, unlike people in previous periods who had no problem with that because they believed in supernatural phenomena. We no longer do. So let's assume that we take this as a template. We go through space, and the reason why that's important is because we no longer have a sense of place. Everything we do is related to our sense of place, our home, our town, our neighborhood, our world, the time in which we live. This is all about us belonging to a particular place. Well, first of all, that's something we have to let go of. We are no longer part of a particular place. We can be anywhere at any time as the minute we think about it. Just imagine an area, heaven, or whatever you want to call it, and you're not in a physical place anymore. You can be anywhere you want to be at any given time. You only have to think about it. The second thing that doesn't exist as we travel through space is the concept of time. Time rules us more than we are aware of. And the reason that we do that is because we have a limited life budget, whether it's 60, 70, or 80 years. And so we use time to sort of use that budget very, very carefully. So our lives are completely ruled by what time is it? When is the next meeting, and so forth. And let that go. So that's also gone. So it no longer matters if we're 30 or 50 or 70 years old, if we're a babe or if we're an old person. It doesn't matter. You are what you are. You are the essence of who you are. Your energy essence is. That's what it is. It's your being. And the third thing is the end, the concept of an end. There is no end. There is no end to the universe, as I just mentioned these. So that's how we should start. And a lot of people I talk to about this say, well, if I want to meet my parents, or if I want to meet my brother or sister who preceded me, how do I know where to find these people? Because there must be billions of spirits in that world. And there again, we are so invested in this concept of place. We are here and the other person is over there. So we need to go from A to B. Forget that. You simply think it and you're there. You want to see your parent, think it, and you are there. You're in communication with that person. And all is governed by what all of these people in these near-death experiences call is love. There is no other word for it. I know that sounds sappy and 70s and far out, man, but it's really true. They all talk about this overwhelming sense of love. Jesus called it agape. We're not talking love in a sexual or erotic sense. We're talking love in a sort of a non-physical sense, compassion, love. And they all talk about this idea that wherever you go, you're surrounded by love. All of the things that we experience on earth, pain, suffering, envy, hate, violence, it's gone. Imagine it's all gone and you're there. So then the question is, okay, if that's where we were and that's where we go back, then what the heck is the purpose of doing this slog on earth? Buddhists believe it's sort of a punishment that, you have to go through life and you have to go through multiple cycles of life in order to ultimately divorce yourself, distance yourself from your physical being until you reach nirvana. Well, we don't see it quite that way, but there is definitely a similarity to it. As Sue explains, the purpose why as a spirit, as an energy, you are sent to earth there to inhabit a human coil and then to ultimately go back is because of the experience, because you are now faced with decisions all your life. It's all about free will. She said one of the greatest things that the energy gave us is free will. So you go down there and you're in this Petri dish called the earth. And now let's see what you do with that. Some people try to make a good life, a moral life. They are enriched. So when they go back, they carry that experience with them and help others to carry that forward. And then there are people who make some really bad mistakes, who are involved in crime, who murder people. And these people come back and they are not punished. They're not going to hell with fire, but they are confronted with what they've done. They are most definitely confronted with them. People call that, a large percentage of near-death experience patients call that the life review. It's not confrontational. It's not like, what an idiot you are. But they say, we are impelled to consider the damage we've done. And it makes us ashamed and it makes us feel like we want to do better. That was the whole purpose of the experience. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse of what that afterlife is like. The important thing is, and that's the one thing I want to leave your audience with, is I have certainly abandoned much of my fear of death. But what's important for us to remember, not only for the person who is dying, but for us who are witnesses, is that there is a great promise of happiness that awaits that person. Now, I know that's a big leap of faith for us who are material monists. We're creatures of a material world, but try to at least open up the possibility that that may be the case. And if you do that, if you are aware of that, and I'm not telling you to read my book, but if you do, it's called The Search for Heaven, on Amazon or anyone else. I hope that will open your heart to the possibility that that essence within ourselves will survive death and live on.
One thing I just kept thinking throughout the whole book is that there was a saying that we are not human beings having a spiritual existence. We are spiritual beings having a human existence. And I couldn't get that out of my head throughout reading your book, and I really appreciate it. It really was an enlightening conversation. Dr. Jean-Pierre Isbouts, let's not wait until the afterlife for the next one.
Sounds good, Brian. Thanks for having me. It's been a great time.
I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Take care.
Like I said before, this is just part one of a two-parter here. We looked at evidence for the afterlife and that consciousness can exist outside of the body. The next logical direction is, if you do die and all of that is a possibility, is there a God that you're going to meet in the afterlife or after death? We're going to be back next week. That's right. I'm not going to make you wait that extra week. So make sure you join us then when we talk about 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe, or as Dr. Stephen Meyer, our guest, puts it, the God hypothesis. Until then, be well and let well be. I'm your host, DJ BJ Turnoff, signing off for The Mind's Eye. The Mind's Eye podcast with BJ Turnoff is available on iTunes, Pandora, Amazon, and all major platforms. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you subscribing.